Here's something, John. I find this really intriguing because it shows you the commitment that they've had from the SEC. So when you and I were younger, and even just in the last 10 years, how often did we even think about an SEC team in any kind of basketball way? We thought about them in football for sure, right? And they've been this big growing. They were absolutely dominant in so many different ways. And a lot of people will say SEC is the best football there is. There's always arguments about Big Ten, all the rest of it. Well, I think that the amazing thing to me, John, is that the SEC got 14 teams are in the NCAA tournament from the SEC. I mean, if you want to show what your commitment is, I think that sort of says it all, right? I mean, and I'm not just talking about some of the schools that they've just brought in there. I'm talking about Alabama and Auburn and Tennessee. And, the list goes on and on. I think it's absolutely amazing what they've been able to do on the football side. I wouldn't say they're absolutely dominant because the Big Ten's done a good job against them. But it's the Big Ten and the SEC in football. Right now, it's the SEC in basketball. And it used to be an ACC thing, right? It used to be some of them. Now, here's where I was going to go with this after I'm just blown out by the fact that they've got 14 teams in this thing. It's just amazing. And they probably missed somebody. There's probably somebody else that maybe deserved to be there. But they stopped at 14. So here's what I got. So let's do this. A lock team that you think is going to win it. And I'm going to tell you right out of the gate, even though he's hurt, it's got to be Duke for me. Because A, great coach. B, great group of guys. C, they really do need their best player healthy, though. And that is the one issue I think that stands in the way. But, John, watching them take apart some of the schools the way they did, whether it's a North Carolina, I'm talking about very competitive teams that they go up against, and they run them off the court. I think that they are the easy one to pick. That's why I wanted to do two. The second one is this. So there's all these brackets out there, right? They got all the teams, all this fun stuff. Who's your dark horse? It doesn't mean that we think they actually will win it all, but I'll give you one. It's a Big Ten team that has 5 Minnesotans playing on it, but it isn't the University of Minnesota because we didn't make it to the NCAA. Matter of fact, we just fired our coach, Ben Johnson. Great guy, great coach. They didn't give him any NIL money, John. So, that kind of tells you a little something about the commitment for them. They had some. They had about $700,000 for the basketball team compared to these guys in the SEC and ACC and the Big 12 and all the rest of them who are getting huge cash hoards, right? They didn't give this anything at Minnesota. University of Wisconsin is the team I'm going with. They are loaded. They are really a tough team to beat. They're physical. They're athletic. They shoot really, really well, John. And it's Minnesota East or whatever. So it's University of Wisconsin at Madison. You know what? I don't think they'll actually win it, but they're one of those teams where they've got enough talent. The way they played up against Michigan and some of the other teams in the Big Ten that were, better. I think Wisconsin could be a dark horse that they maybe at least tweak it a little bit and get a couple victories in before they're gone. Maybe they even get a little further than that. What do you think?
Well, like you said, Duke, Florida, Auburn, those are ones from the SEC that everybody's kind of picking. I'm going to say Kentucky, Pete. I know it's not a real dark horse. I get it. It's Kentucky. But that is one that probably people are overlooking at their own peril, if indeed you're overlooking it for your bracket. So Kentucky Wildcats would be mine, Pete.
Yeah. Well, and shout out to Rick Pitino, who's in 2 years done an amazing job at St. John's, John. His son coached here at Minnesota, and he and I and his son kind of enjoyed a cigar one day down there at Castro's here in Minnesota. Let me tell you, Rick Pitino is one of the nicer guys. People can say whatever they want about this. That guy's a basketball coach. Look at what he's done. Because you can point to a lot. And, everywhere he's been, from the highest of the highs down to the lowest of the lowest, the guy is an absolute gamer. And you know what? It's amazing because he's not a young man anymore, but he still looks pretty damn good. And his coaching skills have not slipped at all. He knows how to speak to those guys, and it's really a lot of fun. Cincinnati Bengals. They have gone out and they have signed two of their wide receivers who the world thinks are probably as a group now, they've been arguably the best team as far as receivers go in football. Here's my issue, though. They just gave both these receivers ungodly amounts of money. One of them is getting money, John, that is now, everybody's getting higher and higher. He is the highest paid non-quarterback player, okay? So that's one of their receivers. Now, Burrow's got his own, contracts as well. Then he's got another receiver. Here's the problem I have with it, though. I think receivers, and I've said this before, if I'm a GM, are a dime a dozen. I'm not saying any of these guys aren't as good as everybody thinks they are, because they are. But the difference between the top 3, 4, 5 receivers and the next go down 20 receivers later, I don't think it's that big. So if I'm sure happy if I'm Joe Burrow right now that I've got my receivers, right? They're back. They're happy. They got all the money in the world. What I'm not happy about, the offensive line. Because isn't that something we all just learned watching the Philadelphia Eagles with the studs up front that they built on that and got themselves a Super Bowl? The Detroit Lions, who were, arguably the best team in the NFC, but they lost, so they were out. What did they build it on? Offensive line. Joe Burrow, John, has had 200 sacks in his career already. Joe Burrow hasn't been playing all that long. So give that a little bit of a thought. And let me ask you this. Am I totally off my rocker on this receiver thing? Because I love these guys. I think, Chase is great. Higgins is great. They got a pretty damn good tight end as well. But you can't pay all that money to those guys and still pay for an offensive line. And how about Hendrickson and some of the defensive players that they've got, right? I mean, I think that they have spent too much money in receivers. It'll look great at times, but I think it's going to be a problem for Burrow when he's got 5 guys in front of him that are not looking anything like Philadelphia, Detroit, the Chargers, or any of these guys.
It will be difficult. I mean, it's one of the things that held the Vikings back, obviously, against Detroit and against the Rams, in their final few games.
100%.
And it's something that you cannot have a second-tier offensive line and expect that you're going to be able to go up against a first-tier defensive front like Philadelphia's and get away with it. It's just not going to work for you. And as good as Burrow is, if he doesn't get at least 2.5 seconds, a lot of those throws are going to be, overthrows just to get rid of the ball.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we'll see. They could still strengthen themselves, whatever, April 24th draft, Pete.
Mm-hmm.
They could still strengthen themselves there, but because they didn't have a great year. Right. They're lower middle of the pack, which means they get, better picks in every round than, for instance, the Eagles or the Kansas City Chiefs, because, those are the top guys. And Kansas City needs to rebuild, and the Eagles need to get some more DBs. They need another DB draft like they had. And by the way, Pete, speaking of DBs, what did you think of this? I had to throw an extra one at him today, folks. All-pro cornerback Derek Stingley Jr., and I think that name should be familiar to all of us because of who his father was. But this kid made his own way. This isn't a Nepo baby. This
Right.
kid is one of the best corners maybe ever, including Dion and all that, Pete. He just got a $90 million contract extension. $89 million of it guaranteed.
Why not just do 90? Honestly, what the hell? Just say 90. The whole thing is.
Can you imagine, though, Pete, a
Yeah.
D-back getting that kind of money?
Right.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And the kid is a player. And the other kid that came out with him, Pete, is looking for that same kind of cash.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, these guys. And it's amazing how these GMs can move that money in a certain way. And there's all these little tricks of the trade. And they've got there's a team of guys who look through these contracts to figure out how they can do this. Because all of us sit here going, well, wait a minute. Now, we went up $53 million in 2 years, $22 million this year, but there was a lot of teams that were even over the number already. So Yeah, they got a little extra room. That's great. But these contracts, John, are unbelievable. But they shift the money around and they turn it into bonuses and they do this and they do that. I mean, it is Wall Street, and it just happens to be playing football on Wall Street.
Yeah. And on Wall Street, there's no limit to how much you could pay somebody. I mean, just look at Musk. Part of that contract that keeps getting disputed is $56 billion. $56 billion. It wasn't that way when they set it up, Pete. It was just a percentage of ownership of the stock if they hit certain levels. Well, they exceeded those levels and the stock exploded. So how much was his stock worth when all of a sudden it went from lower left to upper right? $56 billion.
Not bad.